So, I have a question for you this morning. It's a question that derives its source from where we have been over the last several Sundays. And it's actually a very simple question. Why have you been saved? Why have any of us been saved? Why? You know, it's a favorite question of a 3-year-old, right? Why? And the reason is because it's fundamental to who we are. We like to ask, why? We need to know the answer, the reason, right, behind these things. Why have I been saved? Why has God extended His power to raise us from the dead? Why has He turned me, a dead sinner, into someone who knows Him? Why? Why? Is it so we can go to heaven when we die? Or is it so we can escape going to hell when we die? Is it so we can enjoy our best life now and experience all the goodies that God has in store for us in this world? Is that why we were saved? Interesting that that would be the answer that most churchgoers would give today, isn't it? The why is always, well, because, you know, if I don't get saved, I'm going to go to hell and I'm not going to get to go to heaven. Now, that's true. I'm not discounting that, okay? I'm not suggesting that isn't true. But the fact is that I think most churchgoers get this wrong, get the answer to this question wrong, because they assume that their salvation is all about them. That it's fundamentally about what God has done for them. The fundamental question is, why have I, underscoring the I, been saved? Right? Why have I been saved? Let me remind you that we are dealing with a theological thought which has permeated Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. You remember in chapter 1, Paul told the Ephesian church that he was praying for them, remember? And he was praying for them because he wanted them to understand, to experience the power of God in their lives. He wanted them to understand what the power of God was. Remember, he said he wanted them to grow up in knowledge of God, that they might grow in wisdom and revelation, and that they might know the fullness of the hope of their calling, the riches of their inheritance, and the power of God. He wanted them to experience in every aspect of their lives the power of God. He wanted them to understand what the power of God really is, contrary to how it's popularly expressed. He wanted them to understand the truth of who God is. He wanted them to embrace the power of God and to live the power of God. And so when you turn the page to chapter 2 then, the first 10 verses of this chapter are designed to say this is how the power of God is being expressed. This is what it means that the power of God has come. This is what it means for you to understand this power so that you can live it. It also sets forth, of course, in the midst of that, a central tenet of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The central tenet of the gospel of Jesus Christ is the very cornerstone of the power of God being expressed over us. That salvation, our being saved, is entirely of grace and not of human choice or human will. It's not something we're doing. It's not something we desire. It's something that God is doing. It is entirely of grace. And Paul points out that in order to truly understand the concept of grace, it is imperative to first understand our natural spiritual condition. What we really are in our natural state. In the first 3 verses of this chapter, of course, Paul lays out that the human race is spiritually dead and unable to desire righteousness or cooperate with God towards any goal of holiness, no matter what it might be. We are, in our natural condition, Paul claims, utterly and completely spiritually dead and incapable of cooperating with God in any sense in order to be righteous. And then Paul goes on in verses 4 to 7 to say to truly understand this concept of grace, it is imperative to also understand what God has done. What has God done? That God has exercised His power to raise us from the dead, to take us out of this spiritually dead condition and to lift us up and to give us life, to put life into us, as I said last week, to put life into our soul and then to pull that life back out of that soul into every aspect of our existence, to bring that life forward in every sense, to include us then in all of the riches that the Father has promised to the Son. Everything that Christ has been promised is also given to us as we come alive in Him, as we are raised in Him. But there's a third aspect to this that Paul really wants us to see as we come to the last few verses of this section. To truly understand grace, then, not only do we have to understand who we are and what God has done, but we also have to understand why God has done this. To understand grace, you have to understand why. And what Paul is going to argue here is that the power of God is not just to raise us to life, but to actually raise us to a state where we are useful and productive in what He has purposed us to be. It's not enough to just be alive. We must live. It's not enough to just be alive. We must live. The dead corpse on the slab must not only come to life, but he must get up from the slab and go out and live. So, as we look at verses 8 to 10 of Ephesians chapter 2, here's how we're going to look at this. First, I want to talk briefly about the popularity of this passage or pericope. Then I'm going to talk a bit about its grammar, which will lead us to a discussion, very short discussion of its flow, and then finally how it applies in the way that God sees the matter. All right, so we'll start with the popularity of this pericope. Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, I think, can be demonstrated to be a very popular, highly popular, often quoted passage of Scripture. You hear it frequently. And you hear it in many branches of the Christian church. I think everybody seems to get the idea that something important is contained here, right? I mean, everybody seems to understand that. Something is being said here. I myself have contended in earlier sermons from this book that the gospel rotates around the statements found in this pericope. Both sola gratia and sola fide appear here as the core of a biblical soteriology. The very center, the very heartbeat of the Christian faith is found here. So fundamentally, when people quote Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, they know there's something important there. They know it. You will notice that even the Apostle Paul understood how important what he was writing, because you will see that he repeats himself. Back in verse 5, he said, by grace you have been saved, and he repeats it again in verse 8. It's a clue that even Paul himself understood. What I'm saying here is essential to the understanding of the Ephesians for the gospel of Jesus Christ. However, even though this is an oft-quoted passage, there are a number of errors that are made in regards to this passage in general. There are a number of errors that people make when it comes to Ephesians 2, 8, 9. Let me give you just a few of them, if I might. First, and one of my favorites, is that this particular quote is often pulled from its context. It's often pulled out of Ephesians chapter 2, And we get this picture then by pulling it out that salvation, the salvation gleaned from within it, is void of the deep darkness of sin and death that's outlined in verses 1 to 3. What's interesting is that you'll have many people who will utterly agree with you that Ephesians 2, 8, and 9 says what it says, and then turn around and deny what Paul says in verses 1 to 3. So they yank it out of its context to say you have been saved by grace through faith, but they cannot answer the question, saved from what? Oh, I'm saved. Saved from what? In fact, R.C. Sproul has a little book entitled Saved from What, because he wrote it after he was accosted by a young man who was doing evangelism on the college campus that he was teaching at. And he was late for class one day, and he's hoofing it across campus, and he runs through this commons area, and this kid chases him down to ask him if he's been saved. And R.C. tells the story that he was so much in a hurry that he just blurted out the first thing that came to his mind. He turned around to the kid and said, "Saved from what?" and kept on going. But it's a really good question. You cannot take Ephesians 2, 8, and 9 out of its context without understanding what's already been said in verses 1 to 3. So this morning I'm going to re-preach 1 to 3. No, I'm kidding. Secondly, this passage is often treated overly simplistically. The concepts of grace and faith that you find here are very often watered down from their radical nature to something more innocuous or easy. Faith and grace are both treated with a sense of lightheartedness that makes this passage lose its value when you don't really understand what it is that Paul is trying to say. But then thirdly, and here's the one that I think is probably the most real, and that is that the quotation of Ephesians 2, 8, and 9 often ends before it's done. The conclusion in verse 10 is often left out. Often left out of the quotation. Notice how I've been calling it Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. When in fact the quotation should be Ephesians 2, 8 to 10. And the reason why verse 10 is left out is because 8 and 9 is, okay, I can believe that, but verse 10 is troubling and uncomfortable. It implies something that is inconsistent with the default view of humanity. And when we look at verse 10, you'll see what I mean by that. Listen, hear me. A robust understanding of these three verses will not only give you a good view into God's understanding of salvation, but will also give you the purpose from within His purpose. A robust understanding of 2, 8 to 10 will give you not only an understanding of salvation itself, but an understanding of the why involved with it. If we give it its due. So let's give it its due. As I said, I wanted not only to talk about its popularity, but I wanted to talk about the grammar here. There are various grammatical issues that arise here, and I would say that they're both referential issues and definitional issues. Yes, big words, but pay attention. Referential and definitional issues. So let's start with the referential issues. Let me read verse 8 in this way. I'm going to read it with emphasis. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God. All right, now you'll notice I emphasized two words, specifically the words this and it. And here's where the referential issue comes from. What do the words this and it refer to? What is the antecedent of the words this and it in English? What is Paul referring back to when he says this is a gift and it is a gift? What is he referring back to? Now, it's obviously a reference to the immediately preceding sentence, right? I mean, when you say something and then you say this, you're referring back to what you just said. So somewhere in verse 8a, we have the antecedent of the words this and it. There have been three solutions proposed to this issue over the centuries. So let me explore them with you. The first solution is the one I think that most people gravitate towards. And that is that the words this and it are references to the word faith in the previous verse. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this faith is not your own doing. Faith is the gift of God. Now, I cannot disagree with that in the general sense, because it's certainly true, given other passages of Scripture, that the natural condition of the human race, as it is spoken of in verses 1 to 3, automatically imply that faith is not something we naturally possess. We've already had this discussion when we were in verses 1 to 3, but it's worth repeating, right? If we are in fact spiritually dead creatures, then we cannot, by definition, trust in God. Or let me put it this way. How can someone who hates God turn and trust Him? Doesn't make any sense. It's impossible, right? The enemy of God cannot say, I am going to now trust this God. I hate Him, but I'm going to trust Him. That doesn't make any sense at all. So it's certainly true that faith is a gift. It must be a gift by virtue of the fact that it must be the very act of God Himself. It must be God Himself granting to us something that we do not possess. If God says, the way by which the promise is kept is for you to trust me, I'm going to have to give you the ability to trust me, because you don't have that ability naturally. Okay, I get that. Now, let me just point out, of course, that the synergist, the semi-Pelagian of verses 1 to 3, remember a couple sermons ago, the synergist argues that faith is in fact something that we have an inherent ability to do. The synergist, by virtue of his semi-Pelagianism, says, well, we're dead, yes, in the strictest sense of we don't really want to come to God. But we're not incapable of coming to God. We're not incapable of trusting God. And if you give us just the right circumstances and you give us just the right moment and the right opportunities, then we might just believe. And so our goal, of course, as synergists is to go out and to try to make the gospel as appealing as possible so that people will believe it because, well, they can. And that's what the synergist would argue. But I've already said, of course, that Paul makes the synergist disappear theologically, because what he says is that we aren't just incapable or diseased, we're dead. Paul chose a specific word up there in verse 1, because he wanted to be clear that our spiritual condition is not one of some lack of ability, but rather an utter inability by virtue of sin and death in us. The synergist argues that we have the ability to respond. Paul says we do not. Therefore, the logical conclusion is that faith is in fact a gift from God. So the solution, number one, that's given here is that this and it is referring to faith. Now, certainly that's a possibility, but let me offer you a second possible solution, and that is that this and it are actually referring back to the word grace. That it is grace that is a gift from God. Now again, certainly true. Because grace, by definition, is a choice on the part of God to act benevolently. If it is a choice on the part of God, then the gift must be the very act of God choosing to save us. So a gift equals grace. When you give a gift to somebody, you are exercising a moment of grace. You are choosing to do something. I'm going to talk more about this concept of grace in a moment, but certainly it is true that this and it must refer back to grace in the technical sense. If salvation is entirely the choice of God, then grace itself can certainly be the gift. So many commentators that you will read will pick a side on one of these two and say that this or it is referring back either to grace or faith. But there is a third solution. And it's the one that makes my life a whole lot easier. Watch this. It's both. In fact, I would argue that this and it are actually referencing back to the word saved in the previous verse. Salvation as a whole is a gift from God. Now, here's why this is the best solution to this issue, is because grammatically speaking, saved is the verb in the sentence, while grace and faith are adjectives, or they are nouns being used as adjectives to describe the verbal condition. The verbal condition is being saved. Saved by grace through faith. But saved is the key. Key issue of verse 8 is that we are saved. Our entire salvation, from beginning to end, is a gift from God. And it includes the grace of God to grant it, along with the induction of faith as the means to embrace it. So when Paul says you have been saved by grace through faith and this is a gift, what he's saying is you've been saved as a gift from God. It's by God's grace and it is through faith. You are saved by a gift. It is a gift. What? It is saved. Now again, I'm not dismissing or diminishing the idea that we can say to people that faith is a gift, because indeed we can infer that from the sentence. Certainly if we believe verses 1 to 3, we believe that God must give us the condition of faith and the opportunity to respond by virtue of his call. Certainly that must be the case. But the primary gift is the gift of salvation itself. Faith is simply the means by which it comes to play. Let me point out that verse 9 actually clarifies this assertion. When Paul says, and this is not your own doing, it is a gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one will boast. What is he referring to? What works-based issue is he referring to? And the answer is salvation itself. You cannot save yourself by what you do. You cannot boast about what you've done in order to be saved. Your salvation must entirely be of God. The gift is God willing to save you from the wrath that is to come. So the referential issue of this and it, I think, is best clarified by saying, when Paul says that this is a gift, what he means is we have been saved as a gift. He has given us grace to be saved. He has given us faith to be saved. But fundamentally the gift is that he is actually willing to save us. Which leads then to some definitional issues, grammatically speaking. So let's talk about some terms here that need to be defined. Remember I said a moment ago that I think that one of the biggest problems that we have in our world today as people quote Ephesians 2, 8, and 9 specifically is that they minimize or trivialize some of the words that are used in this passage. So let's look at what they really say. First, let's look in verse 9. I'm going to skip verse 8 for a moment and go just to verse 9 and talk about this phrase of works, not a result of works, so that no one will boast. You know, works is one of those words that we as Christians kind of use as a cliche word. We just kind of throw it out there. Works. But if you had somebody who had never been in the church in their entire life and they walked in and you start talking about salvation not by works but by grace, they're going to go, well, what do you mean by works? What does that mean? You should declare it. We need to clarify these things. And by the way, we're now moving into a culture in which the words of Christianity are no longer familiar to people out there. You know, it used to be that you could use Christian terms before and people just in the culture would understand what you meant. Not anymore. We're 2 generations past that point, okay? We got to clarify our terms all the time now, what we're talking about. Now let me point out that the word works appears here in verse 9, but it appears again in verse 10. In verse 9, it's used as negative. In verse 10, it's used as positive. There are good works, and there are works that are not good. In verse 9, there's works that are not good. In verse 10, there are works that are good. Here what Paul is talking about is something achieved or achievable by fallen humans. In essence, if I could borrow a term here, this is a form of synergism. Works in this case is defined as a sense of I'm going to cooperate with God and I'm going to do my part, right? The synergist believes that some amount of effort is required, in this case for salvation, even if that's just quote-unquote stepping out in faith. Again, whatever that means. Now they deny it as a work, but unfortunately the synergist contradicts themselves when they then insist that human beings can come to faith without any direct work of regeneration. The argument of the synergist is, I don't need God to intervene. I can do what I want towards God without Him actually expressing some sort of effort towards me first. Now the problem with that, of course, is dead people don't do that very often. Right? I've never seen a corpse decide, I don't quite look exactly the way I want to look, so I'm going to repaint. Doesn't work. You see, in Paul's way of thinking of things, anything that we can point to in ourselves is ultimately a form of a boast. Right? Anything that we can point to in ourselves is ultimately a form of a boast. So works, for the sake of standing, are the antithesis of faith. The opposite of faith, then, in this context, is works. So when Paul says here, not a result of works, meaning not a result of what you try to do to cooperate with God in order that God might be pleased with you. Because anything that you try to do on your own would mean you'd be able to stand before God and say, well, I did that, which is fundamentally a form of a boast. And so Paul says, in order for no boasting to be true before God, it must also then follow that we do nothing in order to boast. Nothing at all in order to be saved. So this point of works in verse 9 is the point of what we think we can do in order to bring ourselves into some sort of right relationship with God. Now make no mistake about it, my friends. Every single religious system on this planet believes that you can do something to make yourself right with God. Every single one. Now, I realize our Catholic friends would argue that we're saved by grace alone and not by... that we're saved by grace alone. They would argue we're saved by grace, but we're saved by grace plus what we do. In other words, the way they would say it is, God gives you the grace to do what God commands you to do. Well, that's Pelagian. That's why I said Catholic theology is fundamentally Pelagian. And much of Protestant theology is exactly the same way too, as it's bound up in synergism. I'll do my part, God does His part. And let me just make a correction, okay? A clarification. I made a statement a few weeks ago as I was talking about synergism, that the synergist says there's 100 steps between you and God, right? God takes 99 and you take 1, right? Okay. And somebody took that out of context. Someone small, about yay tall, sitting up here. told his parents that the only thing he remembered from one of my sermons is that there's 100 steps between me and God. He takes 99, we take one. That's not true. That's not true. There's 100 steps, and each of those steps is infinitely wide, okay, between us and God. And we take none because we're already dead. We can't walk. So the first word is works. Works in this case is the synergistic idea of embracing some sort of cooperation with God. But now let's go back to verse 8 and look at this word grace. I'm going to put before you a new definition of this word that I've not used before. It struck me this week while I was considering this verse. Grace is the radical choice of God to include and draw a people for His own glory. A radical choice of God to include and draw people for His own glory. Now, let me once again point out that there are very many bad definitions of the word grace in the church today, even amongst some of our closer Protestant brothers and sisters. Grace is not a tangible gift. It doesn't have substance in and of itself. God doesn't pour out His grace like some sort of water over you in some sort of tangible way. Grace is not a tangible gift, and grace is not a wink by God at the seeker. Grace is not some sort of way of God saying, well, just come if you want to. And grace is not a lowering of His expectations upon humanity. Grace isn't God saying, well, you know what, I know you're a sinner, but I'm just going to kind of overlook some of it. No. And grace is not a willingness by God to change. God doesn't say, I'm going to be something different in order to meet your expectations. Grace is none of those things, even though that's a lot of the ways that people speak about grace in our society today, and even in the church. Now, yes, I know that Paul will say the grace given to me, for example, in 1 Corinthians 3:10, but what he's really implying in that statement is that grace itself is followed by the tangible thing that he needed. Paul said, God gave me the grace to go out and be a builder. So He didn't give me some sort of tangible pouring out of grace. He gave me, by His willingness, the ability to go build. The tangible thing was the ability to go build. The tangible thing is forgiveness. When God says you are forgiven by His grace, it means the forgiveness is the tangible thing. Grace is the choice to give it. In other words, grace is more than just the simplistic, unmerited favor that we talk about when we talk with children about the concept of grace. Yes, we can teach our children that grace is unmerited favor. But as adults, we ought to really understand that grace is a radical choice by God. Now, here's what I mean by radical, okay? I'm going to get it for this one. Grace is a radical choice because it is a choice no sane person would ever make. Now, all deference to our Lord, please don't strike me for what I'm saying. You know what I'm getting at here. The radicalness of grace is that it is a choice by God that He should never make. Ever. That's how radical this choice is. It's a choice by God in which He would say, I would never, never do this, but I'm going to anyways. Now, I use the term sane person here because in our world, as human beings, we might look at a particular situation and say, I would never do that. Why would I ever choose to do that? That's the kind of picture being painted here. And what I mean here is, think about it this way. Given the rebellious nature of mankind and his utter hatred of God, grace, by definition, is radical because it is beyond belief that God would actually choose to be good to anyone. The fact that every human being in their natural unregenerate state hates God, what in the world would motivate him to say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to love that one, even though he hates me. In this is love, not that we loved God. You could put parentheses, we hated him, but he loved us. That is grace, my friends. The choice, a radical choice by God. Radical beyond our comprehension. A God who we simply cannot even imagine why he would dare even to think about us, much less choose to save us. Our problem with grace is that we don't understand it because we make choices all the time that are just here and there, but this is a choice. This is a choice by the living God to do something beyond our imagination. There is no way, and don't even try, there's no way for us to truly understand why it is that God would choose to be merciful to me who hates him. Why would he do that? It's because it's called grace in the character of God himself. Why would God choose to rescue an enemy? Because that's what we are. We don't love God in our natural fallen state. We hate him. We want to do what we want to do. We want our own destiny to be in our own hands. We don't want some God telling us what to do. Look around, folks. Look around. This is the world in which we live. Do not be surprised by the moral revolution taking place around us. Don't be surprised by that. This is what the world is. God is lifting his hand of grace upon this country. Trust me. God is lifting his hand of restraint. And he is allowing human beings to be what they really want to be, which, by the way, is the very definition of judgment, is it not? When God says, I'm going to let you be what you want to be. And this is why we are seeing this massive moral revolution taking place around us. And make no mistake about it, it is infiltrating the church too. There are churches, for lack of a better term to call them, that are embracing this moral revolution. Just this past week, if you're not aware of this, you will be now, the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood issued a statement called the Nashville Statement. And this is a statement of the orthodox position on human sexuality. It's got 14 different articles written in we affirm, we deny format, which is designed basically to say, this is what the church believes. This is what Orthodox Christianity believes about sexuality. The pushback against this statement was immediate and fierce. Trust me. And there will be much discussion over this for a very long time. I think it's a good thing because it draws a line in the sand. Finally, that churches will have to decide, are you for biblical sexuality or for your cultural sexuality? You decide. And if you go this way towards cultural sexuality, you're dead. You will be overthrown by God. He will have nothing to do with you anymore. You will become irrelevant to him, as many of these churches have already proven as they've gone that way for years. The fact is, we should not be surprised by this kind of culture around us because this is the nature of the human race. We are living in a day in which we get to see it so much better than our ancestors did. My great-grandparents and grandparents lived in a very different world than we live in today. We now have it ensconced in law that two men can marry. Never been thought of just 50 years ago. This is the world in which we live. You and I have an opportunity to look at what humanity really looks like. We get an opportunity to see the dark underbelly of what humanity looks like. We get the opportunity to see what Ephesians 2:1-3 really says. And we get an opportunity to see the grace of God in a way I think that previous generations did not. because we get to see the strong juxtaposition between people who are spiritually dead and haters of God versus those who have come to know Jesus Christ. The radical choice that stands between those two positions, where God himself says, I will love that. That's grace, my friends. And it's radical. Far more radical than we really know. But Paul then moves to another word that I think is also seriously deficient in our understanding of all things nowadays, and that is, of course, the word faith. And I'm going to bust out my handy-dandy definition of this word, of course, which you've heard me say before, that faith is a radical trust in the promises of God. A radical trust in the promises of God. But notice again that word radical in there. Faith isn't just, I have faith. My name is Oprah. I sell books. And I have faith. Faith in what? She puts her faith in herself, does she not? As do all human beings. They put their faith in themselves. What makes biblical faith radical is that it's a turning away from self to something else. I am no longer trusting in me. I'm trusting in His promise. That's the radical nature of faith. And it's also radical, okay, that's step one. Step one is a radical trust in the promise of God. But it's a radical trust that permeates every aspect of the life of the one exercising it. There is no faith in you if your life is not different from these. Faith is only faith when it changes us, when it changes our allegiance. Did you understand what I just said? Faith is only faith when it makes you loyal to Christ above everything else, including yourself. How did Jesus put it? If you want to be my disciple, you have to hate your father and your mother and your mother-in-law and your children. You have to hate everything else and love me supremely. Faith is only faith when it forces our loyalty and our hope to Jesus and away from ourselves. Faith is only faith when we love Him more than anything else, and we will do anything He commands, without question. He says jump, we don't say how high. We just jump. Faith is moving away from a trust in ourselves to a trust in someone else. That's why it's radical. That's why it's radical. So the first word that needs to be defined, of course, is that word works, that synergism that we think we can do in order to be right with God, which leads us to the idea of grace, the radical choice of God, to love those who hate Him, and faith, the radical trust of the believer in the promise of God, which changes their allegiance. But this leads us to verse 10. And the word workmanship. Now that's a different word in some translations. I'm using the ESV here. For we are His workmanship. Anybody here woodworker? Woodworker? Workmanship is the idea of something made. Make something. When we talk about something having good craftsmanship, for example, we're using basically the same idea. It's well made. It's well formed. It's not cheap, right? It's got good substance. It's got solidity to it. It's a creation. But Paul uses this word workmanship, for we are His workmanship. He means something crafted for a purpose. Something crafted for a purpose, right? It's an act of grace that leads to faith as a work of God to form something, to make something new. You see, this is the problem, folks. If we are indeed spiritually dead rebels against God, and we hate this God, and He extends His grace to us to change our nature by virtue of being born again, that we might trust in this Christ, we become something new. Now, how many quotations do I have to put in here to prove this? For we are new creatures in Christ. As Jesus said, you've been born again by the Spirit of God. The prophet says, I've taken out your heart of stone and put in a heart of flesh, right? How many quotations do we have to have in order to demonstrate that, yes, we are something different if God's grace has been exercised towards us? We are not what we used to be, because what we used to be is utterly opposite of what God has formed. But, it isn't just God making us into something new to put us up on a shelf and say, look what I made. Isn't that pretty? No. It is for God exercising His act of grace to lead to a condition where those who have indeed been born again go out and do, what does He call it here? Good works. If the bad works are us trying to cooperate with God in order to make ourselves right with God, then the good works must be those things that are not trying to save us, but rather things that flow naturally out of what it means to be this new thing that He's formed, right? He has carved us into something new, and we have a different purpose. We have a different purpose. These good works that Paul's talking about, I think, are preordained acts to be carried out by the elect in accordance with His purposes in the world. God has created a people which He uses to accomplish these things. We have been remade by God. We have been formed by God for all the various things that God would have us to do. Shall we list a few? We've been created by God's grace, recreated by God's grace to worship Him. Now, if you're paying attention here, you will notice that worship, the first good work that I just listed, is exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite of what we were doing before we were born again. Were we worshiping God before? No, we were running around hating Him. And according to Paul in Romans 1, we're worshiping everything else other than Him. We have been formed as a people to worship this God. And by the way, not in the way that we think we should worship Him, but in the way that He's prescribed in His Word for us to be worshiped, which is to gather together with other saints and raise our song to Him. This Lone Ranger Christianity that's become very popular in our day, that, I can just worship at home, There's a better preacher than that guy, and I can get them on TV, so I can just sit in my living room in my bathrobe eating last night's leftover pizza and watch the sermon. That's what I'll call worship. But it's not biblical. It's not worship. We're created to worship by this God, which means we have a natural propensity to do so, by the way. How about prayer? My subject for Wednesday nights. Am I not making this point that what God has created us to be is a people to pray? Now get this, He has created a people to actually go into His presence and join the eternal conversation of love that's taking place between the Father and the Son and the Spirit. We get to join the conversation. The rebels don't get to do that. The saints do. And the list goes on and on of things that we have been formed to do. We have been formed to go out into this world and preach the gospel in order to call the elect forward. We have been remade in the image of Christ in order to minister to one another and serve one another. And the list goes on and on of things that the Scripture speaks about, that we have been crafted into a form. Now, with those 4 words behind us, let's look at the flow of this passage then. I said this will be short, and I meant it. Paul, first in verse 8, states how God has exercised his power in the elect. How has he done it? He has chosen to save them, and then has exercised saving them by the means of faith in Jesus Christ. Sola gratia, sola fide. Grace alone, through faith alone. All right? So, first verse, Paul says how God has exercised his power. And then in verse 9, Paul clarifies that this power in the elect is purely divine. This is not a synergistic power of he does his part and we do our part. It is a power divine only. God's strength is exercised to bring about this salvation. But then in verse 10, once Paul moves from the how, now he moves into the why. Paul establishes that this power in the elect gives them purpose. We are saved for so much more than just escaping hell or getting into heaven. We have been saved in order to be his workmanship and to do what he has established for us to do in these good works. Now let me make it clear what Paul is doing here. Verse 10 answers Paul's prayer request in chapter 1. Verse 10 answers Paul's prayer request in chapter 1. What was his prayer request? That the Ephesian church would know the power of God. What does Paul want them to experience? Does he want them just to experience salvation? No. He wants them to experience the whole gamut of what it means to be one who has been saved by grace through faith. Meaning, the power of God flows through them to accomplish what God has preordained for them to do. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared, when? Beforehand, meaning these are things God had purposed to do in our salvation. You're not saved just to get to heaven. You're saved in order to be someone who works out the things that God has purposed for us to do, that we should walk in them. So let's just look at a few facts here. Paul writes to a church filled with people who've already trusted in Christ, right? Okay, so this is a church. It's filled with Christians. He thanks God, remember chapter 1, he thanks God that these people are included in the divine decree of God. He is so grateful that God has established a decree and included the Ephesians. Then he prays. The third fact of reality of this first 2 chapters is Paul prays that they would deepen in their understanding of God's power. So now, Paul outlines how that power comes to bear. Dead in sin, raised with Christ, into a life through which the power of God flows. Through which the power of God flows. The true follower of Jesus Christ, then, the one saved by grace alone through faith alone, denies himself, right? What does Jesus say? You must deny yourself and follow after me, right? The true follower of Jesus denies that he deserved to be saved or cooperated in getting saved in the first place. The true follower of Jesus says, wasn't me. I didn't do anything. It was God's grace entirely through faith. I'm trusting in the promise. That's it. Secondly, the true follower of Jesus Christ denies that he gets to determine his future for himself. It's not my future, it's his. Do with it as you will. I deny any access to my future anymore. And thirdly, he denies that he's any longer in charge of his earthly existence. And this is where it gets tough. It's easy to deny the first two. It's easy to say, oh, yeah, no problem. I didn't get saved by anything I did. God did it. Oh, and I could say, sure, I know. God's got my future all laid out for me. But the really tough part of this is where it really gets hard, is that we have to deny, as followers of Christ, that we are in charge of anything in our lives anymore. It's not up to me. It's no longer up to me. Tomorrow, what happens tomorrow is up to the Lord. What He calls upon me to do, I will do. If tomorrow He says to me, pack your bags, you're going to Rwanda, so be it. We're not in charge anymore. That's why this is so tough. Because we still hold those vestiges of the flesh which want to live in both worlds. I want to believe that I'm saved by God's grace. Oh yeah, I know. He's created me for do good works, but I'll just do those on Sunday. Monday through Saturday is mine. Okay? Particularly Saturday afternoon, right after kickoff, that's mine. Okay? I had to get a plug. I did something about the game in there somewhere, right? See, we think our existence is up to us. We get to walk out of this building, go get in our cars, and drive away thinking, okay, this week I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. But the true follower of Jesus Christ reads verse 10 and says, you know what? My life is not mine. What I do is His. What I plan is His. My goals are His. He is free to do with me as He wills. We can chase all kinds of things. But as followers of Christ, our goal is to chase those things that God has prepared beforehand for us to do. Are you willing to ask Him, what have you prepared beforehand for me to do? Now, there's an old axiom in prayer which says, don't ask for what you don't want because you might get it. But this is a really good question for us to ask. Lord, what would you have me to do? My plans are this. What are your plans? To truly experience the fullness of the power of God, the fullness that Paul was praying for these Ephesians to come to understand. What did he want? He wanted them not just to know they've been raised from the dead. That's good. He wanted them to experience the power of God in Christ so radically that they would submit every aspect of their life to Him. That's where the power of God is found. The power of God is not going to come to try to help you through whatever you want to do. The power of God is going to come through you to help you do what He wants to do through you. It's foolish for us. It's easy for us, but it's foolish for us to pray, oh God, would you help me to accomplish this goal I've defined? It's a lot harder to pray, oh Lord, would you give me not only the goal, but the power to accomplish it? That's why I say that Ephesians 2, 8-10 is very misunderstood. And verse 10 is often left out of the equation because the radical nature of what it is that God has done in us demands something many of us are not willing to give. But if we're going to truly say we've been saved by grace through faith, then we have to understand verse 10 to be true of us.